This is Chip Carter. Welcome to the Nonprofiteers podcast. Chris Goldblatt is a CEO and founder of the Fish Reef Project, which converts empty seafloors into thriving new biogenic marine communities, ecosystems, to provide a home, breeding ground, and feeding grounds for all kinds of new marine sea life. Chris is a fascinating leader. He's faced down some horrendous obstacles in the course of his career, which have not dimmed his spirit or Fish Reef's progress. His perspective on nonprofit work and leadership is both unique and amazing. So now I give you a deep dive with Chris Goldblatt and the Fish Reef Project. Chris Goldblatt, welcome.
Hey, Chip.
Thank you for joining me. Let's start by talking about Fish Reef. How did you get started with Fish Reef?
Yeah, that's a question I get asked a lot, and I guess I just keep shifting the line of commencement, so I have to go all the way back. My mother bought me a scuba course at Catalina Island at a place called SEMI, which is the only place that'll take people under 14 to get certified. So I got certified for scuba at 12 years old, I think it was, in 1986.
Wow.
And then the first thing I started doing was going out with my hoodlum buddies in Santa Monica Bay, which is 30 miles of mud, but you haven't been able to commercial fish in there for 100 years. Any structure in there, after hundreds of dives over mud, you'd find any structure, usually man-made. People put different things down there. You'd see this big halo of life. The black, you'd first see the indicator fish lead you to it, but you're following them, and then this ominous dark mass, and then this kelp and the lobsters and the halibut sitting around it. So it burned into my mind at a very young age the value of critical habitat in an otherwise empty seafloor.
Interesting. Tell us about the mission and vision of fishreef.org.
The mission is to help ocean life thrive, and doing that through placing what we call biogenic reefs throughout the world. Now, a biogenic reef is different than an artificial reef. It conjures up things like sunken ships, or in the past there were maybe even bad materials used like rubber tires and things like that. But those tend to be fishing attraction devices where they're attracting the fish and the divers to a spot. But a biogenic reef is what we do, which is where you're trying to emulate through biomimicry the form and function of nature. So you want to make a reef that looks and acts and feels and lives like a natural reef insofar as humans are able to reproduce that. When you put down sea caves in a couple of years or even 1 year, you should be able to swim over it. And your brain goes, yeah, that looks like a natural structure. And it should be of size and scope to where it exports life out of it over time versus importing life or attracting it to it. And coral ecosystems with a very strong food security component mixed in there to provide food and jobs for developing nations at the same time.
Have other people worked on this? Because it seems like the sea cave concept is pretty new.
I invented it. We've just gotten our U.S. patent approved. The name is trademarked. The photos are copywritten, and this and a number of other different countries around the world. So that is a certain novelty. There have been other designed reef units that have been around for 50 years. And we experimented early on with a couple of those, and there are some good ones that are out there. The Japanese really pioneered it in the early 70s when the 200-mile sovereign limits went around, where every country got 200 miles for its economic exclusive zone. Japan was pushed back to its own shores for its fishing operations and had to increase its food supply in the ocean around. And it turned to making a bunch of different designed reef units. And some were more successful than others. But they were they were species specific. So you had one for abalone, one for lobster, one for kelp, one for sea urchin, and they were cumbersome and took a long time, days to weeks, to make one. And we wanted something that was one size fits all, that worked for every application and was mass producible, yet was superior in quality in terms of its durability and the way that it functioned and worked. And that was the genesis of the sea cave. And the proof is in the pudding. If you look at the pictures of all the kelp and the fish and the lobsters and the abalone and the coral, I'm very proud to say that we scored a pretty perfect bullseye on that one.
I've seen the pictures, and it's really fascinating. Do you have to seed the sea cave with kelp or with other biological forms to get it started?
So we have experimented with transplanting kelp from high density onto the sea caves. And it does work. But if you put the sea caves within about 3 miles of a natural extant kelp bed, it will provide enough ambient seed, and you just trust Mother Nature to do its job. And in Mexico, where we have almost 600 on the seafloor now, those seeded and grew giant kelp to the surface in just 7 months with no transplanting occurring. So I would say, no, you don't need it, but you can do it in extreme circumstances if you feel that it's needed. Coral's a little bit different. Coral's very slow growing. We just have a nice video of our Papua New Guinea reef, which has been there for 7 years. And there's some very nice exaggerated cauliflower corals and staghorn corals. And it's a really good way to keep the locals involved and employed too. It's a really good way to give the locals ownership in places like Papua New Guinea to have a coral outplanting program.
So I don't want to get into the technical weeds here, but my engineering brain is going to not allow me to ask a couple technical questions. I know you described using concrete for the sea caves, and I know just from home ownership and domestic projects, the concrete is very alkaline, right? So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Chip. So the pH of concrete standard is about 10. The pH of the ocean in general is about 7.3. So if you throw regular concrete or let's say road riprap in the ocean, it's too alkaline for sensitive things like corals and macroalgae typically to settle on it. So you overcome that with certain additives, microfiber being one, and then there's certain densifiers that we put in a proprietary ratio that neutralizes the concrete, brings it down to about 7.3. And it also prevents any leaching of anything into the ecosystem. It closes all the porosity of the concrete. It increases the tensile strength. And then that's what gives it the 500-year subsea design life as well.
Wow. What differentiates the Fish Reef Project? And not just in terms of the sea cave technology which you've invented, that's new, but also in terms of just your general approach.
We have our pockets of folks around the world, but once people join the Fish Reef Project, they tend to stay. We're the same group of women and men that have been together for about 14 years. That's the first thing, is the dedication to a cause that's larger than yourself. And we operate through attraction, not promotion. This is the first podcast I've done. We don't do a lot of social media. We prefer just to do the hard work and let it speak for itself. We don't go around saying, look at how wonderful this is. We don't burn up a lot of money in redundant salaries. We don't do fancy advertising. We don't try to tell people what to do or what not to do. We don't try to dictate people's lives and pass policies and brainwashing campaigns. We just do the hard work. And I would say what differentiates us is the fact that the ocean, to do a durable project in the ocean that is measurable over the long term, requires such an intense amount of expertise and insanely hard work, because the ocean's a cruel mistress and it will basically wreck anything that you put in it unless it's really well designed. And no disrespect to the fellow NGOs, but a lot of them just don't have the backbone to see something like this all the way through. You have to be an absolute true believer in the outcome of what you're doing. I would say that's the fundamental difference. We're not opposed to fishing. We defend the right to do that. And that's why most of our reefs remain open for fishing. If a government puts the sea caves in a marine protected area, that's what they choose to do. And that has happened, and that's fine. But we do protect, especially young people's rights and native people's rights to access the ocean for their own food supply and to maintain their culture.
It might make you all alone. Not promoting that. That is fantastic. And I love the fact that you're letting the work speak for itself. And I also love the fact that you don't have a dogma that you're beating people over the head with, because in the modern world, with all the opposition and the polarization, it doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. It just makes things worse.
We take the Zen approach to where life is transient and short, especially if you're human. And the reality is anything that we do or don't do really isn't that important. Okay. But it's very important in the meantime to tend to the garden, right? To account for our existence, account for our use of the ocean and the resource in the meantime.
I love the primacy of experience and modeling good behavior over words and marketing. By the way, I teach a meditation and mindfulness class every week.
Fantastic.
We talk a lot about that. You were talking, what occurred to me was really the way to convert people and to get them aligned with your work and to attract people is just to set a great example.
Mm-hmm.
And like you put it, do the good work. I've had many conversations with parents and grandparents at this point about how to raise kids. And there's a lot of research that shows that telling your kids what to do really doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
If you model good behavior, if you pay attention to them, if you give them opportunities, right? And it sounds like some of that philosophy is embedded in your team a little bit.
Yeah, and I had a very unique mother who encouraged me to go take risks at a very young age, and that's why the reef in Baja is named after her.
Oh wow, that's fantastic.
We put her ashes along with my dad's ashes into a sea cave and put a plaque on it. So I hope they get along.
Oh, very nice.
But she just let me go out and explore the ocean from a young age and expose myself to a great deal of danger. I've sunk at sea twice, one time extremely violently. I've had my neck ripped open by anchor chains.
Oh, good Lord.
Had all kinds of stuff happen. Propeller sliced my arm open and stuff like that you normally wouldn't expose a young person to. But it's all of that has led to the ability and confidence to do something like this.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think are the impediments to other nonprofits taking risks like you're taking and being all in?
In a word, vanity. That's because, unfortunately, the donation model requires vanity. It requires donors looking good for having made the donation. And then the nonprofits need to appear to have moved the dial with that donation. So there's like social capital that can be harvested out of it. And there are nonprofits that do agree to occupy a certain extreme part of the nonprofit spectrum. And that's where they exist. And their donors are perfectly fine with that. So there are ones, and some of them, I'll take action over inaction any day. So there are some of them that I think that are totally bananas, but at least there's some action there, right? At least there's some actual risk there, even if it's misguided. I'm like, all right, at least they're doing something.
I just read an article about mistakes that nonprofits make, and a lot of nonprofits succumb to exactly what you're describing. And there was even a name put on it several years ago, more than a decade ago, the starvation cycle, where in order to appear as if costs are low and in order to appear as if they're doing work, and they're not, NGOs particularly, are not just glorified employment agencies, they underreport expenses, they overreport outcomes. They spend a lot of time doing that. They spend a lot of time instead of getting deeply embedded in the program work, which is
exactly. And speaking from my personal situation only, like a decade ago, I'm not a fan of tattoos, but I got a tattoo of a reef on my arm, a reminder that if I didn't succeed, I'd live the rest of my life with a picture of something on my arm that I didn't succeed at. So I needed a reminder to go all the way through. So when you say the poverty cycle, and I'm quite comfortable and proud of it, that I've had to let go more comfortable living, my businesses and stuff like that. I've had to just let those go and rely on donated housing. For a while, went without a vehicle, things like that. I come from a business background, and a nonprofit is first and foremost a corporation. That's a public benefit corporation.
Absolutely.
Set up in the eyes of the law, with a secretary, a treasurer, and a president. And then it also has its beneficial officers, its C-class officers that are in there that you have to list with the state. The CEO, COO, CFO, basically officers like that are responsible for it. And that tells me that the government's really expecting you to run this like a business, with the only exception being that you ask for money instead of sell a product. And what you're so that's the only exception. So some people see nonprofits as a place for their flightiness to subside, or they want to be involved in something that has lack of accountability. And so one reason for our success is I've never allowed that to enter into our world. I've always just run it like I run my businesses, which is really good accounting. We certainly haven't had to exaggerate our starvation. In fact, quite the opposite. We don't wear that on our sleeves. The fact that there's been a great deep struggle for us personally just to exist while we're doing this, I don't wear that on my sleeve. And sometimes people they look at what we've done and they say, well, you must have $10 or $20 million in the bank to do that, because that's what it would take larger NGOs to pull it off, or the government. And I say, no, just every single dollar's gone into it. And so sometimes they think that we're actually really well heeled because we don't complain.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that's fine. Because soon enough, the resources are finding their way to us quite rapidly. So we're about to go through a very large growth cycle, and then reality and perception will somehow beat up in the middle.
So what are throughout the last 12 or 13 years, what have been the biggest challenges, the biggest transitions for you running Fish Reef Project? What did you take away from those?
Yeah. First of all, I love challenges. All it did, it's just like the scene in Star Wars where you can strike us down, but it'll only make us stronger. What was that with Obi-Wan Kenobi said that? And it's very true. Yeah. It's very true. And so you had your organic challenges of not knowing what you're doing in the beginning. So how do you make a reef? Where do you put it? How do you permit it? What do you tell the public? What's our logo? What's our slogan? What's our mission? How do we manage this financially? What do you do? There's zero knowledge base. So that's just the learning curve, right? And some things have a much smaller learning curve than others. This had a massive learning curve. Yeah. And then you have regulatory challenges, such as in California, where there is no reefing permit, period. What we had to do is go through all of the state and federal agencies, all 14 of them, and guide them on what we're doing, and basically go through a permitting process that was akin to, say, putting in an oil rig or a pipeline. And there were no discounts financially given for this either. They did treat us with respect, but the price tag was just as high as if we were ExxonMobil or something like that, putting in something with an environmental negative impact. So we had to overcome that, and many people thought it was just impossible. I'm happy to report, Chip, we have our permits for Goleta in our hand, so we're going to deploy. Yeah. And it really is historic for California to permit the first biogenic designed reef like this. And we can rebuild our entire kelp forest that's been missing since 1983. Yeah, good for you. Kudos for getting through all the regulatory morass. Let me give you one quick anecdote. So we've been at the United Nations Seabed Authority as permanent observers since 2014, where we were voted in by 170 countries as permanent observers, which gives us rights and access almost of a delegate, of a national delegation. So when we speak there in the microphone, it goes right into the ear of all the world leaders in their own language. Fantastic. And we were able to get code and kind of laws passed that require mitigation for ocean impacts when mining in the ocean. And when we were doing this, we were taking direct shots at us from the largest environmental groups in the world, that I won't mention their names specifically, but you can figure out who they are, because they didn't want to share the pie. They didn't want to share the vision. And they just me sitting there taking shots from a multi-billion-dollar organization to such an extent that the Secretary General said, you guys need to go out in the hallway and settle this before I kick you both out. And that the level of intimidation, and I am so grateful that those folks did that to us, because it brought us all the way up to their level overnight. That attempt to expunge us from their world, all it did was give us a permanent seat at the table. It showed that you can go toe to toe. Yeah. And so that's the kind of example I want to give. And man, it is, I cannot tell you how terrifying that experience actually was, because I'm sure. Yeah. And to the point to where the security services at the UN told me I should take a 2-day holiday and take a breather and think about things. And I came back 2 days later, completely sublime and accepting of any outcomes. And that's when all of a sudden the system started to give itself over to us. You have to be super passionate about your work and detached from outcomes. That's a very good way to move through the world. And I don't always succeed at that. Sometimes I hold on to the outcome a little too tight. None of us do all the time. It takes a lot of practice, which sounds like you've had. I was going to ask which was more fun, working with regulatory bodies or actually deploying a fish reef, but I know the answer to that. Yeah, loading and deploying, of course, is nerve-wracking, because you're dealing. It's not unlike the invasion of D-Day, where who was the general? Was it MacArthur? Yeah, MacArthur. He's sitting in England looking at the weather reports, going, "Oh, all right, it looks okay. Go ahead and go into June 5th, I guess it was, right? And we got a little weather window that hopefully it doesn't turn out too bad. It's not unlike that, because you're launching. And once you're loaded on that barge and you give the order to pull the trigger, there really is no going back. And we've been lucky. When you go back and you see the growth a number of months later, that's really the Shangri-La moment. That's really when you have your moment.
How did you stay motivated during that period? And the other thing I was going to ask is, did the state of California actually learn anything from you in the process?
That's it. That's a very good question.
Because, deploying an oil rig and deploying a small neutral device that's going to encourage ocean life.
There were two parts to that question. One was, did the state learn anything, and how did I maintain motivation? Yeah. It's not that I didn't feel the darkest depths of despair along the way. That wasn't absent from the equation. I think it comes from spending a life on the ocean, where when you're by yourself at sea, 300 miles from land, it doesn't matter what happens, you need to get to safe harbor. Doesn't matter what obstacle that you hit, you have to get to safe harbor. So in my mind, that's basically where I was all the time, because I just needed to weather through a storm. And I just program like that. But ultimately, it just comes down to belief in what we're doing. The belief is strong enough to drive it through. Yeah. And on the regulatory side, I think the state and federal governments probably have learned that there is a roadmap. It's complicated and convoluted, but there is a roadmap to this type of project versus no roadmap. And I think above all, I think we had to prove ourselves as a trusted entity to those agencies, that we're not going to go do something ridiculous. Because in the past, there's been some bad projects where people put bad things in the water and they go, I got a permit, I'm not removing it, or I'm not going to pay attention to you. And a gold miners mentality around whatever it is they made, that get off of my lawn. And we took the exact opposite approach, that this is for the public benefit. The reef belongs to everybody, and it's simply managed under the same auspices as any other sovereign piece of seafloor. And it's not ours. We don't own it, and we don't dictate what happens on it. The laws of the land do.
Would you consider the state of California to be a partner now? And could you talk a little bit about the partners and the partners you forged and they work with you? Because
when you say the state, there's a number of agencies, right? You have California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which is not a permitting agency, but they do advise the other agencies. And they do make you put together a very comprehensive monitoring program, right? Yeah. And then you have other agencies that actually issue a permit. I would say that they're really remarkably helpful. And the buck stops with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They're the big boss at the end of the tunnel. I got to say that they were very thorough. They were absolutely look under your fingernails to just make sure that nothing bad is happening in the ocean. And I respect that. Yeah. Although as you're going through it, you're pulling your hair out. And you want it to be over. That's for sure. But I would say that we're a partner with the state insofar as the Kelp and Seagrass Restoration Act was passed in the state legislature last year, which kind of requires the agencies to participate in any really good scheme to rebuild our kelp forest. To put it conversely, if you go make a reef in Alabama, it costs $35 and takes an hour to get a permit. It took us 14 years and $250,000 to get a permit for California. I think maybe we can shore this up in the middle. Florida's got a good program where it costs about $1,000 and takes about 6 weeks. To work.
Love the fact that you're a practical person. What principles do you bring to bear, management? Because I'm sure as CEO, you have to cover a lot of terrain, not just not just program work, but dealing with fundraising and everything else. Anything you've learned over the years that is worth sharing?
Yeah, if you notice, my title is CEO. It's not executive director.
Right.
Okay, so start with that the buck does stop somewhere. Yeah. And stops with me. And so people understanding where the leadership is and having a clear, concise, unchanging vision without mission creep. I think conveying to people, if you do have the money to pay them, that you say, okay, this is what I can pay you. And when that money is over, it's over and the job is over, unless you want to volunteer beyond that. And so clarifying the fact that if you want to contribute something, a skill, whether you're an artist or something, that you are a willing volunteer and you're not in this to try to leverage financial gain now or in the future. If people can be salaried in the future, that's something that we'll explore if the funds are there. So there can be confusion about that. So I think clarifying that people are volunteers, what their duties are, and still holding them to account. Don't let too many flakes into your world, because that eats away at your energy. So making people do something, a gentle hazing, to where it make them come towards you and make them prove that they actually are worthy and want to be part of the organization, has been very successful. It's a vicious cycle.
It's part of the starvation cycle. Let's say that you could wind the clock back, knowing what you know now. What might you have done differently? And I realize it's a loaded question, because, and you suggested this earlier, every mistake or challenge, this is a cliche, but there's an opportunity, underneath, alongside it. But is there anything big that you would have done differently, or any mistakes that you made that were impactful?
Yeah, maybe three small things. Number one, I would have early volunteers. I would have made it very clear contractually that they were volunteers and not people with deferred income.
Yeah.
Okay, I would have made that very clear. I just had this anticipation saying, yeah, I know all these people. I'm in Santa Barbara. I know half of the folks in Hollywood, and no problem. We'll raise a couple $1 million out of the gate. It's been 14 years, and I raised a total of 1.5 million, and half of that was my own savings.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, so that's how hard money is to raise.
Yeah.
So I would definitely not underestimate that component of it. You're born with a silver spoon in your mouth, which can act against you, because then you don't have to provide the outcome.
Sure.
You have to go through a starvation phase if you're going to be successful. You don't necessarily want a bunch of money, but I think that I would have, because you have to figure out who you are and what you're doing before you're worthy of that money.
Right.
The grant cycle is deeply frustrating when you go to folks like the Global Fund for Coral Reefs and some of the other folks that really claim to want to be doing something for the ocean. And then you say, here's something for the ocean, and they say, get lost. That can be very demoralizing.
Yeah.
And you're like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
What are you doing that is more worthy than this with your money? And you never get a straight answer to that. So getting past that level of frustration and carrying on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I found that, frankly, the best way to raise money is through personal relationships and really getting to know people on an individual basis. And you just turn to them as an individual human and say, I really appreciate that $10,000 you gave us last year.
Yeah.
This is what we did with it. Here's the proof of it.
Yeah.
Would you like to donate again, maybe a little bit more? And they see you're a good bet. And then it's incremental over the years. And that's basically the organic way to do it.
Any victories you'd like to extol recently, either in program work or operationally, or victories you've had recently beyond the seed cave, which is an obvious? Yeah.
The full complement of permitting that's approved for California, which is young. We've just received that a couple of weeks ago. That's the biggest possible milestone that we could have accomplished. And the fact that those reefs are already built, they're being trucked up from Mexico. They'll go in the water next week. That's a huge, massive milestone, not only for us, but for the general kelp restoration in all of California. We were the first ones ever to make a reef in Papua New Guinea.
Wow.
And basically how the organization is strong and growing with the same original members. And I just spoke at the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum about 10 days ago. That was televised. We were on the cover of The Independent, a number of talk shows.
I'm happy to help with that in any way I can. I love the work you're doing.
Thanks, Chip.
Any last words of wisdom for anyone who's leading a nonprofit or in the environmental space? And there have already been intrinsic for nonprofit leaders.
So as long as you look yourself in the mirror and you're brutally honest with yourself about why you're doing it and what you're willing to endure, and as long as you're driven by an actual true belief that makes real sense to you, you'll be fine. Make believe in there, and you're telling yourself a fairy tale about why you're doing it in order to get money to do something. You really should just go back to your day job.
Yeah, karma, it'll catch up with you sooner, not later.
If I could just add one more
Sure.
thing to that. Like I mentioned in the past, there's so many successes in the environmental world over the last 50 years, a lot of them came out of the Nixon era legislation with the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Environmental Protection Agency. These things were all came to life in 1972. Yeah. And so we have our gray whale back. We have our seals and sea lions back. We have our white sea bass back, our halibut, our yellowtail, our bald eagles, our condors. All of these things have come back. The raptors, the foxes, all of these brown pelicans, huge successes, huge successes. The sharks are very abundant again in California. Maybe not quite the blue shark, but certainly the white shark is throughout California. So we have to give credit where credit's due as humans and realize that we have the ability to positively affect the outcome if we just focus our resources over the long term, and to not fall into a state of despair about climate doom or anything like that. I think that just really works against us, and realize that we can affect positive change.
Yeah, I love that. What's the best way for potential or existing donors to plug in?
If you go to the website, fishreef.org, you can donate up to $60,000 per donation on there. Anywhere from $1 to $60,000 is all appreciated. Over $100, we'll send you a beanie, which is great. Fish Reef beanie. And then larger checks you can mail in to the address on the donation page. And we qualify for all of the donor advised funds, such as Fidelity and Schwab and things like that.
Okay. Chris, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you, and best of luck to you. Please keep me posted.
Thank you.
Take care, Chris. Bye.
Cheers.